Of all the things we do, of all the behaviors that mark humanity, one of the most dramatic and one of the things that many people regard as defining is our capacity for language. It seems to be unique. It is certainly enormously important. Think for a second what your lives would be like if you couldn't speak or sign or communicate through language. There would be no stories, there would be no books, there would be no internet, there would be no computers. In fact, there would be no history. We would know nothing beyond the things that you experienced in your daily life from the moment you were born. So not only would there be no history, there would be no science, no culture, no government, no cities, no towns. We would live the life of very smart apes, which many people argue we are, in troops of perhaps 40 or 50. The consequences of not having language, of course, go beyond just our own ability to interact. The face of the world is dramatically changed by virtue of human activity. And to a very large extent, that activity is made possible by language. So there's no question that language is important, and as I've said, it does seem to be the thing that many people regard as peculiarly and uniquely human. As far as we know, we are the only species that has language. And that presents a bit of a puzzle, because one of the very dramatic and impressive results in evolutionary biology over the past 100 years, and more recently through developments in molecular genetics, is the remarkable fact of the continuity of life, the similarity of species. We like to think we're different, but as we look at the genomes of related animals, we discover that there is enormous similarity, a much deeper similarity than we're first aware of. So the question is, where does language, if it is truly unique, come from? Where did it spring from? And that's the puzzle that I want to put before you and tell you a bit about the things that we know so far. Of course, we're not the only species to communicate. Many species communicate. So the first thing I need to do is to tell you a little bit about what I mean by language and what's special about human language compared to other non-human communication systems. One of the simplest ways of communicating is through a very passive display. So here you see moths and butterflies that have evolved to develop patterns of coloration on their wings. You'll notice most of these look like eyes, and they're designed to fool a predator, typically a bird, from above into thinking that this is a large animal. Stay away. That's a form of communication. It's an involuntary form of communication, but it serves the purposes of these moths and butterflies very well. There are ways of communicating among insects that have been well studied. One of the best known is that of the honeybee, which leaves the hive periodically in search of food, and when it comes back, communicates with the other bees in the hive as to where it has found food. This seems to be done through a variety of signals. Some of them are pheromones, chemicals produced by the bee. One of the earliest methods of communication was the so-called dance. So if you look at the bee in the center, as I start the movie, you'll see it's wiggling around in a figure 8 shape. The direction of that figure 8 against the hive, the speed with which it moves, all combine to tell the other bees the location and the distance of the source, the food source. So that's another way of communicating. And throughout the insect kingdom, there are some very rich and impressive ways of one member of the species to communicate. Among primates, vervets emit a particular set of calls in the presence of a predator. So some calls may signal that there is a snake or a bird or some other animal. And that call then tells the other animals to leave. But it's a fixed repertoire of 4, 5, maybe 6 different calls that it makes. And so it's a way of communicating. It's very important. But it's fairly limited in terms of its forms. If you look at the higher primates, bonobos, chimps most notably, you do find what I think is a very impressive ability to communicate. Now, it's not typically through vocalizations. One of the curious things that distinguishes humans from non-human primates is that we have a very fine control over our mouths, our articulators, in fact, even our ability to breathe. I'm told by primatologists that if you drop a chimpanzee in a swimming pool, it'll sink like a stone. They can't be trained to hold their breath. But they can communicate manually through sign language, and they can understand spoken language. So Kanzi, who's a bonobo that's very well studied, I want to show you a bit of what Kanzi does, and then ask you to think about how to understand that. This is Kanzi as a cute little bonobo baby. Cute little bonobo babies grow up to be not so cute bonobo adults. And this is Sue Savage Rumbaugh, who has worked with Kanzi over many, many years to teach Kanzi to sign and, in fact, to understand her language. So let's look at a clip of Sue Savage Rumbaugh in the kitchen with Kanzi working together.
I got the onions in a bowl. Let's go put them in our hot food, and we'll come back and turn the TV on. Get your onions right here and put them in your bowl. Look, you spilled some of them.
The chimps have responded well to such a rich environment and show an unprecedented grasp of spoken English.
Let me get you a spoon to stir it with, Kanzi.
In addition to spoken language, they receive a steady stream of nonverbal cues, attention-directing maneuvers, and repetition, the hallmarks of the way we speak to young children.
Yeah. Will you wash this potato off for me? Could you wash the potato?
Sue Savage Rumbaugh is convinced that the combination of all these everyday interactions at an early age is essential for the acquisition of language. Scientists call this process enculturation.
All right, your noodles are going to go in here, and you can have a few of them for your tummy. Kanzi, could you turn the water off again, please? Turn the water off, please.
In the kitchen, in Sue's company, Kanzi functions impressively. But does Kanzi, like a human, really have the ability to understand words?
And that's the question. What is it exactly that Kanzi understands? Now, I take it as very impressive that Kanzi can function in a kitchen and interact with Sue in all of the things that are needed to do to cook. Kanzi spent a lot of time in the kitchen, so this is not the first time Kanzi has done this. But put yourself in Kanzi's place, or better yet, put yourself in some unfamiliar language context. Pick Farsi or Hungarian, and imagine you were working with a Farsi speaker and you knew a few words, onions, water, things like that. You probably would get fairly far and be able to do the kinds of things that Kanzi did, based on the knowledge of a few words and based on knowing what's appropriate behavior. Okay? So without meaning to belittle or diminish the impressiveness of what Kanzi's doing, it's probably, this at least is not a conclusive demonstration that Kanzi is able to use language in any of the complex ways that we normally think about it. And we'll talk a bit about what that might mean. So is it language? Well, let me give you some examples of the kinds of things that seem to be remarkable about language. And they're the sorts of things that you don't normally think about. So we grow up speaking or signing if we're deaf. And we don't spend a lot of time reflecting on that and reflecting on just how remarkable this capacity is. So let me call to your attention 4 of the things that people have found to be puzzling and impressive, and show that the language capacity really may involve more than we thought. The first one is the task that is faced by every newborn infant who comes into the world not knowing language, in fact, not even knowing that there is such a thing as language or that there are words. And one of the first things the child has to do is to learn words. Milk, mama, bed, bath, no, all the important words. What's so difficult about that? This is an image, it's a picture of a sound wave of some speech. And if I were to ask you, so time goes along the horizontal and there's amplitude excursions and the vertical. If I were to ask you how many words do you think were uttered, I don't know. I don't know what you'd say. You probably look at the areas where there are the big bubbles and assume that those are words. So this might be a word, maybe this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's not clear. And the problem is that unlike written language where there is white space between words that tells us this is a word, this is a word, this is a word. So even if you look at an unfamiliar language, written text, for many languages and many forms of orthography, you can identify where the words are. In spoken language, they all run together. There's no white space between words. There are no flags saying I'm the beginning of a word or the end of a word. So the poor little infant really has a tough time even figuring out where the words are. In this example, this is a recording of this utterance.
Where are the silences between words?
Where are the silences between words? And if you look actually closely, aligning the words with the parts of the speech stream they correspond to, you see that there are silences in the middle of words. So if an enterprising infant were to say, well, words are separated by silence, they would be misled. So it turns out to be a harder challenge than you would have even thought of. We take for granted that we can do this very well. To give you a flavor of this, does anybody here speak Tagalog? Is anybody a Tagalog speaker or a speaker of some Chinese language? I see giggles around. I need a volunteer. Would you say a sentence, make up a sentence, a couple of seconds, say anything you want as long as it's polite, and say it loud so everybody can hear.
Tôi là Nhã, tôi là một học trò ở trường UCSD.
Okay, now, thank you.
The last part was really
Thank you. Now the question for the audience is how many words were there? How many words were there? And my guess is you're probably floundering. I certainly am. How many words were there? 10 words, okay. Thank you, thank you. That's exactly the problem that an infant faces in an unfamiliar language environment. It's not only learning what the words mean, but where they are. What is a word? It turns out that infants are particularly good at what you might call figuring out the statistics of the speech that comes in. What do I mean? Well, there's an experiment that was carried out by Safran, Aslan, Newport a number of years ago, where they played 7-month-old infants 2.5 minutes of synthesized speech that sounded like this.
Pabikuti budo golatuti budo daro pi pabiku golatuti budo pabiku golatu daro pi pabiku daro pi pabikuti budo go.
Enough. So if you transcribed it, it looks like this. Pabiku lati do re pabiku, so on and so on. And then they exposed the infants, after they had listened to this for a couple of minutes, to 2 other different types of artificial speech that sounded like this. One consisted of real words and one consisted of non-words. And you're asking, well, what do you mean a real word? None of this is words. Well, it turns out, if you look at the structure of this, there are repeating sequences. Pabiku pops up again and again. Latido pops up again and again. They're all run together. Whereas something like dorepa only occurs once. And what these investigators found was that the infants were very sensitive to these repeated sequences. And they treated a repeated sequence as if it were a word, even though it was all run together. That was a first clue as to what constituted a word. There's a whole host of other research that's very interesting involving infants down to age 4 months, showing this amazing ability to listen passively and figure stuff out. Babies are not sponges, they're quite active. Here's a second thing that is interesting about language that you might not have thought of. We know we have large vocabularies. Kanji may have a productive vocabulary, meaning kanji can produce signs of several hundred, 250, 300, 350 different words. That's a very small number. A 2-year-old easily matches that. And by the time you get to be a high school student or a college student, you'll have 50,000, 60,000, 80,000 words. So there's a huge difference just in the terms of the number of words that we can store. How do we do that? Well, If you think about the kinds of words that we know, we don't seem to store them as individual items. So we know words like mommy and milk and bottle and various other things. Now, if I asked you to memorize a new vocabulary, you would quickly top off at, a few tens of words, 20, 30, 40 words. You'd be no better than Kanzi or any of the other animals. But the fact is that we seem not to store these words as if they were isolated facts, dates from history or something of that sort. They're organized so that we have groupings of words, words that are foods, animals, people, and so on. And this kind of grouping, this ability to have categories, meaningful categories, makes it very easy for us to organize things and to learn new words. So if I were to ask you, do you want to eat a violet crumble? Does anybody happen to know what a violet crumble is? Anybody here from Australia? It's a chocolate-covered honey candy, yes. They sell them in the Sunshine Store. They're very good. They stick to your teeth, though. But the first time I heard that, do you want to eat a violet crumble? I was a little taken aback at, violet crumble, but I knew that it was probably some kind of food and edible because I had these concepts. I knew about foods, and I know that things are eaten are foods, and that makes it much easier to learn this new vocabulary. So the second puzzle about how to store so many words seems to hinge on a capacity for having concepts, categories. And it turns out animals have very sparse, limited ability to conceptualize or to have these kinds of categories. Syntax, those of you in high school or those of you who were in high school will remember having to parse sentences and study syntax. It was great fun and your favorite subject, I'm sure. What do I mean by syntax? Well, Kanzi and the other non-human primates, higher primates, do have the ability to form what we would call simple sentences, and sometimes they get a bit complex. But there are special kinds of complexities that seem only to be true of human language. So take the sentences, the mouse sees the dog barked. We very easily can combine these into a single sentence using a technique called a relative clause. Think back, 10 years or 10 weeks, however old you are, to when you studied this, and we say something like, the dog that the mouse sees bark. We can combine ideas or sentences into a single form. And that's a very special, interesting kind of complexity that until recently we thought no other animals were capable of. It turns out there's a recent study by Tim Gentner here at UCSD showing that starlings actually have the ability to do something like this. They don't seem to be able to do many other things that are necessary for language, but this kind of complexity, interestingly, is something, at least in basic form, that's within their grasp. One of the things that makes it possible to do this is the idea that when we hear these sentences, we know that there are nouns and there are verbs, that things like the dog are noun phrases, barked is a verb phrase. We don't know this consciously. But at some level, it probably plays a role in our ability to understand language, this notion of what's the good form of a sentence. Saying one thing and meaning another. We do this all the time. I'm not talking about lying. I'm talking about things like saying, this car is a lemon. Now, the car is not really a lemon, but you understand I'm using language in a metaphorical way, and you understand what I mean. It's a colorful kind of way of speaking. And that's really something that almost certainly no other species could come close to doing. Or we say these other examples, if you do that, you'll be sorry. Or if I were you, I'd hate myself. Here we're talking about things that aren't true, aren't real, they're hypothetical. I'm asking you to imagine a world in which if I were you, then I would hate myself. Not me, but you. What about this sentence? I hear snickers. I'll ask Darren, who I see in the audience, to say that sentence. I'll say it loud.
The Varangian binks glorf the napivore.
Okay. Now, like the car guys, I have to say he wasn't given advance notice. He never saw this sentence before, I don't believe. But he pronounced it right, and if I asked you, is that a reasonable sentence? Well, it looks like English, even though it's not. So you can recognize something that's a good candidate as a sentence. What does it mean? What does it mean? And here you say, well, it doesn't mean anything, except if I asked you, would you rather be the Binks or the Napa boar? The Binks, yeah. I mean, you all have strong intuitions. You'd rather glorf than be glorfed, whatever that means. I used this sentence in a class once. I actually had a kid in the back say he'd rather be the Napa boar, which I thought was either daring or kinky. I don't know. Bit of a gamble. So my point here is that language really is different. It really is different than the other kinds of communication systems. And as impressive as they are, and kanji is an impressive animal, they're just things that are far beyond what kanji does, and yet they're part and parcel of our ability to have language. So the question now really is, where does it come from? One of the answers that people have considered is that there's a special organ, a special part of the brain that's the language organ, the language module. And there might also be language genes. Okay, because we know that the brain is not undifferentiated oatmeal. There are areas that have specializations, and it's a plausible idea, and there's some data that suggests that might be true. Although I'll warn you that my punchline is going to be the only thing that's true is that the brain is the language organ. But the region shown on this brain here in red, this is a side view from the left of a brain. The front part of the brain is to the left on the screen. The back part of the brain is to the right. Is an area that has been studied a great deal, and it was given the name Broca's area after the French doctor. He was actually a surgeon who studied some patients in the surgery ward who had a language deficit. One of them could only say ten, ten, ten. And on autopsy, when this patient died, Paul Broca, in the mid-19th century, discovered that there seemed to be damage to this region. And this sort of deficit is been given the name Broca's Aphasia. So aphasia is a language disorder. And Broca's aphasia refers to the type of language disorder marked by halting, disfluent language. Often people have trouble articulating little words, two of the. It almost sounds like a telegram, although I understand Western Union has discontinued telegrams, and some of you may not even know what they look like, but you used to have to pay on a word-by-word basis, and so people would economize by leaving out the little words. The brain that we're talking about is shown here, the actual brain on the left, and we'll return to this in a little bit, but you see the apparent damage in the area in the left, which is the front of the brain, left front, so-called Broca's area. Here is a Broca's aphasic, to give you a sense of the problems.
Because the kids have grown and the house is getting too big, or ready for a smaller place? Seems reasonable. Let's to keep up.
Off screen, the interview is asking some questions, and this gentleman, who is a Broca's aphasic, can only say the word tono. But he gestures and seems to be understanding, but can only say tono. And so this is an extreme form of Broca's aphasia. Now, what's curious is, and it's a clue that things are more complicated than we might have thought. This is the same patient, and she's going to ask him about, I think, how many children he has, and he'll give an answer, and then she'll ask him to count.
What number is this?
What number is this? She shows up a 4, and he says,
count it out.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Nice, nice. Well, since you did 4 so well, let's go for broke. Let's go up to 20 if we can.
Let's go up to 20.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 2, 1, 2,
It's very dramatic because, as far as you might think from interacting with this fellow, he could just say tono, and yet when started with the numbers, you can say 1, 2, 3, it sounds perfectly normal. And that's very typical of many types of aphasia. That things that are overlearned, like the numbers, the alphabet, singing happy birthday, things that seem to be automatic, apparently engage regions of the brain that were spared or, for whatever reason, allow them to say these things. So it's not the case that there is this single region that alone and only this region does language. When broken, it has severe consequences. But there are other areas of the brain that seem able to kick in under certain circumstances. In fact, this ability to kick in is quite remarkable, particularly early in our lives. Pamela Moses, who is a researcher at UCSD, has studied a group of children who had strokes when they were born, at the time of birth or just before. These are lesions, large areas of damage to the brain. So what is shown here is an image of the brain of a 3-year-old girl. It was taken when she was 3. The stroke she had was at birth. In the first panel on the left, you see a view of the left side of the brain, and if you notice, there is a large indentation. Cutting down through the brain from the back, you can see that this region of damage is quite large. And this is a view from the top, as if somebody sliced the top of the head off and tipped it back. So this is the area which in the previous gentleman there was damage in a very small region. This girl is missing essentially almost half of the left side of her brain, which seems to be an area very important for language. And yet her language was close to normal. How did that happen? Well, it turns out other regions of the brain that are not normally involved in language can take over. They can kick in. But this is most true early in life. So early in life, the brain seems to be what people call plastic, meaning it can adapt and mold, and if one region is missing or in some way destroyed, other regions, and there are exceptions, other regions can to a large extent take over. So that suggests that if there's a language organ, well, and it's in the left hemisphere, well, the fact that you can be missing a left hemisphere and still have language is telling us that things must be more complicated. I'll leave it at that for the moment. The other thing that we've realized as we're looking for this language organ is that even though there are regions of the brain that are very important for language, those regions don't seem to be exclusive for language. So what's the distinction I'm drawing? This is a study using a form of imaging called PET, a PET scan, in which the researchers looked at the activity in the brain while expert chess players were playing the last part of the end game of a chess game. And what they found was that certain regions were quite active. And this was true only of the expert players of chess. Now, would you say that, therefore, that these are chess organs? No, no. It's very implausible that we would have evolved to have specific regions of the brain that could play chess. The more reasonable interpretation is that there are regions of the brain which are very useful and very good for playing chess. And if you're an expert chess player, you learn how to recruit these and make use of them. So this is what I mean by they keep their day job. They have other things they do, but for the purposes of chess and for language as well, they get recruited. And that suggests there's not a single language module or organ, but rather a distributed network. Here's another example of that. This is a task which those of you who have taken or will take or are dreading taking the SATs or the GREs may remember. In this task, you're asked to judge, are these two figures shown here the same or different? And you will probably say they're the same. More challenging are these pairs, where they're mirror image, or these. Are those the same or different? They're the same, but one has been rotated. One has been rotated. And so what a psychologist, Roger Shepard, discovered a number of years ago, and many people have studied this since then, is if you measure how long it takes for people to make the decision, is the same or the different. The figures on the left, people can make that decision fairly quickly. So this graph is simply showing you speed of responding. And the more the objects are rotated, shown here, the longer it takes to make that decision. And the interpretation was that that's because people are internally doing the rotation. That's what's called a mental rotation. It's as if your brain is trying to undo that. There is now much stronger evidence that that's probably what's going on. This is a study by Wendy Ark, Frank Heist, and Joan Stiles, all researchers at UCSD, where they use functional magnetic resonance imaging to look at the areas of the brain that were active when people did this task. And they found that there were areas, as one might expect, that are known to be involved in recognizing objects. That makes sense. Areas that were involved in visual attention and so on. But very interesting, an area in the brain, deep in the brain, called area MT. MT is a brain region that is involved in processing motion. And in the subjects, this region was very active. Now, during the task, of course, people are looking at non-moving objects. These are static, stationary objects. So there's no motion, except this suggests there was a simulated internal motion, that a brain region that normally would perceive and process external motion is being used to run a movie inside your head in order to answer the question, are these same or different? Again, in the vein of the opportunistic nature of the brain and the way we do language, is a study that was carried out by Fred Dick, Aisha Sagan, and various others, centered at UCSD, but with collaborators in Italy. This is a brain that has been artificially blown up. So you may have noticed in the earlier images of the brain there was lots of infoldings and crevices, which is the norm for our human brain. Software developed by Anders Dale, Marty Serino, allows you to take those images and, as if you had a bicycle pump in the brain, blow it up so that it's stretched out and you could see into all of these little crevices and nooks. In this study, subjects were asked to listen to sounds like a door slamming, a cow mooing, car brakes, and so on, what they call environmental sounds, the sounds around us and every day. If you look at this image and then compare with the activity in the regions in the brain that are active when people are processing language, you see there is a lot of overlap. So this is hearing the word cow, and this is hearing a moo, for example. So many of the same regions that are responsible for processing language are also actually responsible for processing the sounds that are associated with those objects. So it's clear that we're drawing on lots of regions of the brain, and this requires integration. Here's a very dramatic illustration of the ability to integrate information from different kinds of inputs. This is an activation diagram of when subjects were listening to speech alone. This is when they are seeing people talking, but with the sound cut out. So they're essentially just watching the moving lips. And if you combine these, you see that there is a certain amount of overlap. And it turns out there are ways in which our processing of sound and what we see when somebody's talking do get integrated. Very dramatically, that's shown by this following experiment. I'm going to show this to you twice. First time I want you to look at the speaker and then decide what they're saying. They're going to be saying syllables like ba or ga. You'll hear ba or da or ga, nonsense syllables. Okay?
Ba, 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 ba.
Okay, you heard a bunch of different sounds, I would assume. Now, I'm going to ask you all to close your eyes. I'm going to play it again, and I really want you to keep your eyes closed, okay? And tell me what you hear.
Ba, 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 ba.
Okay, what was different? In this last, you heard what? Ba. You heard ba, 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 ba. But when you saw it, you heard va, tha, ga. This is called the McGurk Effect. It's a very powerful demonstration that our ears can be fooled by what our eyes see. That we integrate automatically. Automatically. Well, the idea that there's a language module doesn't seem to hold a lot of water. We seem to draw on lots of different brain regions. What about a gene for language? We know that we differ by only a few percent from bonobos or chimpanzees, maybe less than 2%. So it's tempting to think, well, let's reserve that 2% for language. Is there a gene for language? I like to comb the popular press for these claims of genes for, oh, take your pick. A gene for genius, a gene for dyslexia. Obesity, blame the genes. Personality, it's in the genes. And this one, a gene offering clues on deafness. This was an interesting story. And this invites us to think that there could be a gene for language, if there's a gene for obesity or a reading disorder or for deafness. But the true story in all of these cases turns out to be much more interesting than that, and certainly more complicated. This gene for deafness surfaced when a geneticist, Marie Claire King, from University of Washington, studied a family in Costa Rica. The family had gone back to the late 1700s when the great-great-great-great-grandfather came over from Spain. And since that time, roughly half of the family members suffered deafness. The deafness started about age 10 and then by 30 was complete. There seemed to be a very strong family tendency, obviously, and that made Claire King think that there was a genetic basis for it, as there was. In fact, she isolated the gene that had a mutation. It turns out to be a gene that is called Diaphanous. How did she know its name? She looked in an encyclopedia of genes. It was an encyclopedia of genes of the fruit fly. Why would she look there? Well, it turns out, and you should all be very disconcerted to know, that virtually all of the genes that we possess exist in animals like the fruit fly. They're very small changes, of course, but basically you can look at the gene and it was isolated in this family and then look in a gene bank from the fruit fly and find that gene or something very similar to it. And in the fruit fly, it's been well studied. It's called diaphanous. What does diaphanous do? It turns out in every cell in your body, you have a little internal skeleton. It's called the cytoskeleton. And that gives the cell its characteristic shape. So here is a magnified image of a cell, and these thin fibers are the skeleton. And this gene helps to build that skeleton. So different cells have different shapes depending on the job they have to do. So muscle cells look quite different, for example, from brain cells, the pyramided cells, or mossy cells, or Purkinje. The sperm cell has this long tail that helps it swim. So the shape of the cell is very crucial to its function, and the shape is determined by this skeleton. And the skeleton is built in part by this diaphanous gene. Well, there's one class of cells in your ear that's really important for hearing. It's called hair cells. And they're a little bit like the teeth of a comb. So as you run your fingers across a comb, it makes a sound. These cells in the cochlea are anchored at either end, and they move back and forth when sound comes in. And their rigidity is really crucial for them functioning well. Well, in this family, the gene was mostly intact, but it was broken at the end, so the protein that it produced for most cells in the body was sufficient to do the job. But here's a class of cells that are very delicate and have no tolerance for any kind of wobbliness. And over 10 years, it started to break the system started to break down, leading to deafness, okay? Well, now, that story is very different than saying there is a gene for deafness. Right? There's a gene for a protein that's very important in the auditory system, and when broken, it can lead to deafness. But that gene is involved in almost every cell in the body. It's just there's this weak chain in the link for hearing that causes it to be damaged. So this is a morality tale. The moral is beware of there being a gene for X. It's almost never the case that there's a gene just for one thing. Genes build little pieces that combine with other pieces in our body to do complex things. There was a family in England I want to tell you about that actually seemed to suggest there might be a gene that, if not only for language, was very important for language. And this is a family known as the KE family. Over 3 generations, About half the members of this family, 30, now 32 members have been studied, half of them turn out to have a language disorder. I'll show you what it sounds like.
They are short. It's best fun. They are 6. My name is Tommy. I live in Peru. And my age is 9.
When this family was studied, it was first thought that the only thing wrong was language. It turns out there are some other things that are wrong as well, that are broken as well. But language certainly is affected very dramatically and more obviously than many of the other things. And so the search was on. What's the gene that's causing this? Could this be the language gene? And actually a gene was located, identified, and made the news. The gene for language surfaced. Well, it turns out to be a very interesting gene. It's a gene that produces a protein called FOXP2. Again, where does the name come from? Fruit flies. This gene exists in a wide range of animals, from humans to rats to fruit flies. And the gene plays a very important role as a kind of master switch in controlling when other genes get turned on or off. And it's known from looking at embryonic development in mice that the gene plays a role in creating a very important structure called the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia exist in a wide range of mammals, and therefore the form of it, humans and mice, is very similar because it doesn't tolerate a lot of changes. The basal ganglia, what do? Well, very interesting. They sit in the middle of your brain, and they're involved in things like controlling motor activity, motion, especially complex motion. They seem to be involved not only in real motion, like playing the piano, but even planning, where you have to think, first I'm going to go here, and then I'm going to go here, and then here. So sequential behavior that's complex seem to be the domain, one of the domains of the basal ganglia. So this family had a mutation that broke this structure. And again, thinking of the gene for deafness, well, language requires many things, one of which is a very fast rate of speech, complex control over your tongue, your lips, I think your larynx, and so on. And when that's broken, language fails. Chimps, I mentioned earlier, cannot voluntarily control their vocalizations. And it may well be that the form of the gene we have differs from them in such a way as to allow us to do this, to connect the basal ganglia with the right structures so that we can control our breathing and so on. Small changes make big differences. You may have heard this shocking statistic that humans have maybe between 15, 20, maybe 25,000 genes. Mice have between 15, 20, 25,000 genes. We don't differ that much, but small differences can make for big consequences. Somebody pointed out to me the pufferfish has about as many genes as the humans do. And that same person also speculated, pufferfish, you know, fugu, they'll kill you if the two most toxic species on the earth have the same number of genes. So another way of thinking about this, and this phrase many people have thought of. Liz Bates, a colleague, late colleague from San Diego, used to talk about the language relied on being a new machine built out of old parts. We have the same parts as most chimps and other animals. And so the old parts might be the areas of the brain that are processing environmental sounds that get recruited for language. And what's unique is this ability to recruit them. Connections, I talked about the integrative brain, tying it all together, really do matter. And it turns out that the connections probably are broken connections are probably what's responsible for Broca's aphasia. This is a slice of a brain, taking a cleaver and cutting it down like this and dropping the face forward. So you're looking back into the brain. Don't try it at home. And what we call the cortex is like the rind of an orange. It's this brownish, usually called gray, but when it's stained, this brownish outer rind that contains the bodies of lots and lots of brain cells or neurons. And those need to communicate with each other via connections that are here shown up as white. This is a tract of connections called the corpus callosum that connects the two halves of the brain. As you'll notice, there is a lot of this white matter. So there's a tremendous amount of the brain, the volume, that is the connective tissue, allowing different areas to connect. Nina Dronkers, who was the person who was interviewing the Broca's aphasic you heard earlier, went to Paris, discovered that the brain of Le Borgne, this was the patient from the 1800s that Paul Broca had studied and had this damage here, was still alive and kicking. Well, it wasn't alive and kicking, but it was around in alcohol in a museum. So she put it into, this is the bore of a scanner, an MRI, to rescan it. And what she discovered was that the area that was damaged was not this front module, Broca's area, but rather some white connective tissue called the superior longitudinal fasciculus running from here. And if you look at the normal hemisphere of this patient on the right side, this is the superior longitudinal fasciculus. It's intact, but it's missing. It had been severely damaged because of a stroke in Le Borgne. So again, it's probably not that there was a module that was broken, but rather the connections between areas was what was broken. It gives us a new insight into what's probably going wrong. Of course, other things are going to matter too. And it's important to realize what sorts of things, how far we have to look in order to try to understand what's going on. I talked about articulation. This is a side view of the vocal tract. All of these things move. Lots of moving parts in your mouth. The speed with which they move is quite amazing. And the precision with which they move is also very impressive. That kind of dexterity, vocal dexterity, is a hallmark of our species. And it's not only something that we do with our mouths, but with our hands. This is incredible to me. What the pianist is doing with her fingers so fast, so accurately. One cannot imagine a chimpanzee, no matter how good a cook it is, doing something like this. Is there a piano playing module in the brain? Well, no. But at the very least, the same kind of structures that enable us to talk fluently and rapidly are probably also recruited for doing the kind of manual gestures that are needed. Another thing we do, we pay attention. You've heard the expression, monkey see, monkey do. Well, monkeys don't hold a candle to human babies. Human babies are imitators like no other species. And they also are capable of something which turns out to be very important, we think, called joint attention. If a parent points off in space, the child will look to see where she's pointing. If I go outside and I look up in the sky, other people will start looking up as well. We're sharing attention, and that's obviously going to be useful if you're trying to teach a child, look, there's a dog, look, there's grandma, as you teach a child words. Now, this ability to imitate and to do joint attention is something that we think happens in the front part of the brain, and there's a very big growth in terms of human frontal lobes versus non-human frontal lobes. There's a recent study by Elizabeth Redkay, Frank Heist, and Eric Korshane. Elizabeth is a graduate student in the psychology department here, where she looked at young infants when they were listening to speech, and she discovered, and this is a view, again, slicing this way across the brain, tipping it back, and then looking down. Front of the brain, back of the brain, and for strange reasons, this is the right side of the brain and the left. So imagine you're a doctor looking up at the patient lying in bed. There are some regions colored in blue that are regions that older children use for listening to language. Regions very close in yellow that are used both by the older children and the younger children. And the very youngest children seem to be activating frontal regions. And it suggests that early language then makes a lot of use of the frontal lobes. these are areas that are not nearly as important as you get further into the problem of learning language. But for learning language, the kinds of joint attention, imitation skills seem to be very important. It's as if language comes in through the front door, I mean, if you want to think of it that way. Okay, let me wrap up what I've talked about. The picture that's emerging is that there is almost certainly not a single language module. There's not a single language gene. In fact, there couldn't be. If you look at the history of biology and species from Aphasia to humans, there is enormous reuse of the same tool set of genes. What does happen is that those genes get changed in very small ways, and the brain structures get changed. Tweaks and twiddles accumulate. And the story is more complicated than there's just a single brain area or gene, but rather the brain areas and the genes that we share with other animals, particularly other non-human primates, have undergone small modifications, and together they make language possible. So imagine this kind of story. Think about bonobos, a type of chimpanzee, macaque, a monkey, humans, songbirds, and termites. And think if we could compare them along a lot of different dimensions. What might those dimensions be? Well, I've talked about some of these: imitation, control over respiration, the ability to control articulators with a dexterity, virtuosity that's unmatched. Here are a half dozen different things that all of these animals can do, but to different extents. And I'm sure there's another dozen that are going to be relevant for language. So where does language come from? Not a single source, but rather imagine that if you could measure the ability to imitate across different animals and control over respiration, you might have a graph that looked like this, every species having its unique profile, and language then is possible where they come together. When you have the dials on the setting on the dials, the tweaks and the twiddles done just right to make language possible. So to conclude, something I said at the outset, if there is a language organ, it's probably the brain. Okay, thanks very much. The question was that...
like if you hold the word like sit, it actually sits down.
So the question was, dogs can read, and how is that possible? My first answer was going to be find another news station. But actually, right. No, but I can believe that animals can be trained to recognize a stimulus. It could be a color, a shape, and as far as they're concerned, the words don't matter. They're not reading the word, they're recognizing a unique shape and learning what it is. Dogs actually are pretty good at figuring out. There's a very well-known recent case of a dog named Rico, a German-speaking dog, German-understanding dog, who had a pretty big vocabulary. And if you put him in a room that had a lot of toys whose names he already knew, and one unique object, and you said, Rico, go get the Greeble. And he didn't know what a Greeble was. He would look, and he knew what all of the other things were, and he knew their names. There was this one new object that had no name. He'd figure that that must be the Greeble, and he'd go retrieve it. That's something infants do. So the whole point of this is that we are unique because the whole package fits together. But that's not to say that you couldn't find starlings, as Tim Gentner did, who have little bits and pieces, or dogs who have other bits and pieces, or kanzi who have other bits and pieces. So the amazing thing is that all of these things come together and you all of a sudden get something that seems to be totally new, but its roots go into things that exist in other animals. Is there a window of opportunity for learning language? There probably is, and it's probably a lot younger than we thought. We know that by age 3, the differences in children's verbal skills tend to be cemented. So what happens before age 3 is really important. There's malleability afterwards. Between the first year of life, the first birthday, and the second birthday is probably a time when the amount of input you hear, sheer volume, this is a kind of surprising and strange result, the sheer number of words that you hear as a 1.5-year-old is a very strong predictor of whether you'll go to college. I mean, to sort of exaggerate a bit. The more words, the better. It doesn't matter that they be fancy or different, just, it doesn't matter the language, just the sheer number. This is a result by Hart and Riesli, who studied Head Start. This is interesting from the viewpoint of autism, because there's reason to believe that a very good predictor of later language ability are these social skills, like the ability to follow a point or follow a gaze or engage in joint attention. And this is something that people who have autism have troubles with. And it may be that this problem is what causes the additional problems, or contributes to additional problems that many autistic people have with language as well. And it suggests that if there's going to be an intervention, it better happen at age 12 months, 14 months, 16 months, which is hard because autism officially doesn't get diagnosed typically until age 3, although increasingly people are kind of moving up provisional diagnoses. So the early window of opportunity is really, it's quite young. Which regions of the brain allow us to use language for abstract purposes? There's an argument that people are increasingly making that what we call abstract really is rooted in our physical experience or sense. So we may think of something as being abstract, but if some of this comes out of imaging studies where you ask people to imagine abstract things, and it turns out it's like those things are metaphors for real events. If I say to you, the river runs along the highway for 4 miles, the river's not running anywhere. River's not moving in that sense. The water is moving, but the river itself isn't moving. But we use the word moving as a kind of fiction or a metaphor. And when people hear such things, which seem to be abstract metaphors, there's reason to believe that areas of the brain that are processing real motion get activated, get excited. And so
it could be connected to like motor.
Yeah, so it could be that there is, obviously there's something additional, because our ability for abstract thought is much greater than that, we think, of chimpanzees, and it may be a kind of a chicken and the egg question about whether this is because, and this therefore makes language possible, or maybe it's the fact that we have language helps us think about things. And there's been a debate over many years about which one is true. The question is a good question, and I don't know the answer. The question was, the fellow who was counting up to 20 was asked to count to 20 and started off 1 to 10 or 11 with real English words, and then fell apart and started saying tono, tono, tono. When if he got to 10, he had 10 more numbers. Were there 10 tonos? Was he counting? And I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised, actually. I think.
He stopped using his fingers.
He stopped using fingers. Well, we only have 10, which is a problem. But it's a good question. I don't know the answer. You'll have to look on the web when this gets put on TV, and you can look at the video and see for yourself. Okay, I think we should stop. Thank you all for your attendance.